Decades have passed since the smoke cleared from the Black Gut, but in the Mississippi Delta, time doesn't heal wounds. It merely scabs them over with mud and moss. The year 1974 is a distant memory to the world, but the swamp has a way of preserving the frequency of violence. If you travel deep enough into the Black Gut today, past the markers that the locals tell you to avoid, you won't find a farm or a distillery. You will find a graveyard of iron and wood that refuses to fully sink. The remains of the Dupree Empire are gone, scattered by hurricanes and the slow rot of the southern climate. But the site of the explosion remains a dead zone. Even 50 years later, the trees in that small clearing grow crooked and stunted, their bark scorched as if the blue flame of the white lightning had permanently altered their DNA. The ruins of the copper still are still there, half buried in the silt, a jagged green skeleton of a war that nobody won. The locals in the nearby towns, men who were children when Jesse returned from the war, still tell the stories over glasses of cheap whiskey. They talk about the ghost of the Delta, a figure in a tattered army field jacket who appears when the humidity is so high the air feels like water. They say that on the stillest, hottest nights, when the moon is a mere sliver, the silence of the swamp is broken by a sound that shouldn't be there, the distant, rhythmic thrum of an airboat fan, or the faint, metallic clack-click of an M1 carbine being readied in the dark. The war for the White Lightning didn't end with a peace treaty. It ended with an eclipse. Jesse disappeared into the fog, leaving behind a legacy of fire that scorched the Dupree name out of the county records. Some say he moved to the Ozarks. Others say he never left the swamp at all. But as the sun sets over the Yazoo River, casting long skeletal shadows across the water, the message remains clear. The Delta still belongs to the shadows, and the White Lightning still strikes those who think they can own the mud. The legend of 1974 lives on, a spectral echo in the humidity, reminding the world that some soldiers never truly come home. They just find new jungles to defend.
When the sun finally rose over the Mississippi Delta, it did so through a thick yellow haze of humidity and wood smoke. The light was weak, filtering through the dense canopy and pale, sickly spears that illuminated a scene of total devastation. Sheriff Bill Campanella, a man who had seen 40 years of swamp violence, pulled his shallow draft patrol boat into the entrance of the Black Gut. He didn't need to see the wreckage to know something was wrong. He could smell it from a mile downstream, the metallic biting scent of charred copper and the cloying sweet stench of cooked corn. The water was no longer black. It was covered in a film of gray ash and iridescent oil. As the sheriff's boat pushed deeper into the slough, the first piece of evidence drifted past. A scorched wooden oar, its handle snapped like a toothpick. Then they found the first boat. It was pinned under a massive waterlogged oak log, its hull crushed into a chaotic tangle of splinters and rusted nails. There were no bodies, only a single water-soaked trucker hat floating in the scum. "Check the banks," Cappy ordered his deputy, his voice low and rasping. They found the killing jar Jesse had created. The deputy almost stepped on a punji pit, his boot stopping inches from a sharpened stake still stained with dried, dark blood. They found the spring pole traps, their iron spikes bent and covered in tufts of denim. It looked less like a moonshiner's hideout and more like a battlefield in a country none of them wanted to remember. At the center of the clearing, the copper still sat like a melted, hollowed-out skull. The blue fire had been so hot it had fused the copper pipes into grotesque, twisted shapes. The ground around it was scorched black, the grass turned to ash. Of the 5 Dupree men who had entered the swamp the night before, there was no physical trace. The Delta mud, churned by the explosion and the struggle, had simply opened its mouth and swallowed the evidence. "What about the soldier boy?" the deputy asked, wiping sweat from his eyes. The sheriff walked over to the porch of the Jesse homestead an hour later. The house was empty. The door was wide open, swinging slowly in the morning breeze with a rhythmic creak thud. The M1 carbine was gone. The duffel bag was gone. The only thing left was a single glass mason jar sitting on the kitchen table, filled with clear crystalline liquid. Beside it was the hunting knife Silas Duprees had used to pin his threat, now driven deep into the table's wood, holding a note that was much shorter than the first. The Delta is empty. Sheriff Cappy didn't call for a forensic team. He knew there was no point. In the Delta, the land kept its secrets better than any man could. He took the jar, poured the white lightning out onto the dusty floor, and walked away. Jesse was gone, Silas's men were gone, and the war was over. All that remained was the hum of the cicadas, returning to the trees to sing over the graves the mud had already forgotten.
The chaotic echoes of the traps were still ringing through the cypress trees when the true nightmare began. The surviving Dupree men, now reduced to 3 and covered in the stinking black muck of the slough, finally laid eyes on Jesse's camp. It was a small clearing, illuminated by the rhythmic, hellish blow of the copper still's firebox. To the Duprees, it looked like an easy target, a final chance to salvage their pride and end the soldier boy who had humiliated them. "There, by the copper!" Silas's eldest son, Bo, roared, racking his shotgun. He didn't see a person, but he saw the pressurized tanks of high-proof moonshine stacked near the fire. He aimed for the metal, thinking a single blast would destroy the operation and leave Jesse with nothing. He pulled the trigger. The lead pellets struck the pressurized thumper keg and the collection vats of 100 proof alcohol. In an instant, the swamp didn't just catch fire, it detonated. Because of the high alcohol content and the pressurized steam, the explosion was a brilliant, terrifying blue. A wall of cobalt flame erupted outward, traveling across the surface of the water like a living thing. Moonshine is unique. It burns with a pale, ghostly light that is almost invisible in the sun, but looks like a piece of the fallen sky in the dark of the Delta. The explosion turned the black gut into a furnace. The heat was so intense it caused the sap in the nearby willow trees to boil, making the wood pop and hiss like 1,000 tiny firecrackers. The blue flames danced on top of the black water, fed by the spilled alcohol, creating a surreal liquid fire that moved with the current. Through the shimmering heat distortion, Jesse finally appeared. He wasn't hiding anymore. He rose from a camouflage dugout 20 yards away, the orange light of the burning brush reflecting in the cold, dead glass of his eyes. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a vengeful spirit born from the smoke. He held his M1 carbine with a relaxed, terrifyingly practiced grip. As the Dupree men scrambled backward, trapped between the advancing blue fire on the water and the thick, impenetrable wall of the swamp, Jesse began to fire. He didn't spray bullets. He was clinical. Each shot was a sharp, sharp crack that punctuated the roar of the inferno. He moved through the smoke with the fluid, ghost-like gait he had perfected in the highlands, appearing and disappearing behind the curtains of Spanish moss. The Duprees were firing blindly, their pellets shredding leaves and bark, but Jesse was a shadow. He used the light of their own destruction to track them. One by one, the orange muzzle flashes from the Dupree shotguns were silenced. The final image the men saw was the blue fire reflecting in the polished copper of the ruined still, a shattered monument to their own greed. The white lightning had become a weapon of total annihilation. And as the last of the alcohol burned out, the only thing left in the clearing was the smell of ozone, scorched earth, absolute silence, war that had finally reached its end.
The lead boat drifted into the narrowest part of the slough, where the water was so dark it looked like liquid obsidian. The Dupree men were focused on the bank, their eyes searching for the glow of a fire or the glint of a copper still. They were so intent on looking for Jesse that they failed to look at the water beneath their hull. The lead boat's bow hit the tripwire, a high-tension monofilament line Jesse had anchored to a submerged cypress stump. The trigger was a simple mechanical release, but the result was a symphony of destruction. First came the deadfall. Above the boat, the 400-pound waterlogged oak timber Jesse had rigged in the canopy was released. It descended with a sickening, heavy whoosh through the air, striking the center of the lead boat with the force of a falling building. The wooden hull didn't just break, it detonated,
Splinters of cypress flew through the air like jagged shrapnel, and the screams of the men were instantly drowned out by the massive splash as the boat was driven directly into the mud of the creek bed. "Ambush!" someone screamed from the second boat, but it was already too late. As the second boat tried to reverse, the men scrambled to the muddy bank, desperate to find solid ground. This was exactly what Jesse had planned. One man leapt from the gunwale, only to land directly onto the punji pit Jesse had hidden under a layer of rotting leaves. The sharpened heart of pine stakes, hardened by fire, tore through his leather boot and deep into his calf. He went down with a guttural howl, his leg pinned to the earth. In the chaos, the Dupree men began firing blindly into the darkness. The flashes from their sawed-off shotguns, brief, violent bursts of orange light, only served to ruin their night vision and reveal their positions. They were shooting at shadows, at the wind, at the Spanish moss. Jesse didn't fire back yet. He let the swamp do the work. One of the men, panicking, tripped another wire. Instead of a log, this one triggered a spring pole, a flexible sapling bent back and armed with a cluster of rusted iron spikes. It whipped across the bank with a metallic twang, catching the man across the chest and hurling him back into the black water. The black gut had become a living, breathing machine of war. The Dupree men, who had spent their lives intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, were now facing a man who had turned the very earth they stood on into a lethal puzzle. They were no longer a raiding party. They were survivors in a killing zone, and the man who built it hadn't even pulled a trigger.
Midnight in the Delta arrived with a moon that was nothing more than a sliver of bone, offering just enough light to turn the fog into a glowing silver shroud. At the entrance to the black gut, the water was as still as a mirror of black ink. Then, the surface began to tremble. Two flat-bottomed wooden boats, painted a dull matte green to swallow the light, glided out from the main channel. They moved with the terrifying, rhythmic confidence of a predator that had never been challenged. In the lead boat, 5 of Silas Dupree's most trusted men sat huddled together, their silhouettes jagged against the mist. They didn't use the loud airboat this time. They wanted the silence. They moved with oars, the wood muffled with strips of burlap, dipping into the water with a sound no louder than a fish breaking the surface. They were armed to the teeth, sawed-off 12-gauge shotguns, heavy-duty flashlights, and the unmistakable sharp-edged profiles of long-handled machetes. The air in the slough was so humid it felt like it could be cut with a knife. It carried the smell of tobacco, stale sweat, and the nervous energy of men who knew they were entering a place they didn't belong. The Dupree men were born in the swamp, but tonight, the black gut felt different. The Spanish moss seemed to reach down lower than usual, and the ancient cypress knees looked like petrified hands clawing up from the depths. "Stay in the center of the channel," the man in the bow whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cicadas. "The soldier boy's camp is just past the split in the creek. We hit him fast, we burn the still, and we leave him for the gators." They moved deeper into the labyrinth, the canopy of weeping willows closing in over their heads like the ribs of a giant beast. Every time a branch brushed against the side of the boat, the men flinched, their fingers tightening on the triggers of their shotguns. They were looking for a man, but they were surrounded by a forest that Jesse had turned into a living weapon. Unbeknownst to them, they had just crossed the first marker, a submerged cypress branch stripped of its bark. From a hidden spider hole in the bank, Jesse watched them through the darkness. He didn't use a light. His eyes had long since adjusted to the monochromatic gray of the swamp. He watched the boats line up exactly as he had predicted, 2 targets moving in single file into the heart of his trap. The Duprees thought they were the ones conducting the raid, but as the lead boat drifted over a shimmering, nearly invisible line of monofilament, they had just signed their own death warrants. The silence of the Delta was about to be broken by the sound of Jesse's war. The fire that consumed the corn crib hadn't just burned Jesse's supplies. It had burned away the last of his restraint. Silas Dupree expected a defeated man to come crawling for mercy or to vanish into the night. Instead, Jesse went back to the only training that had ever truly mattered. He didn't go to the hardware store for locks or fences. He went to his old olive-drab duffel bag and pulled out the gear he had smuggled home, relics of a war that most of America was trying to forget. Deep in the black gut, Jesse began to transform the swamp into a killing jar.
He moved through the waist-deep water with the silent, rhythmic grace of a ghost, his mind mapping the terrain not as a home, but as a series of interlocking fire zones. He understood that the Duprees would come by water, confident in their numbers and their knowledge of the bayou. He decided to use that confidence against them. Using high-tensile monofilament fishing line, nearly invisible in the dappled, humid light, he began to rig the perimeter. He didn't have claymores or grenades, but the Delta provided its own lethality. He spent hours carving punji stakes from seasoned heart of pine, sharpening the ends until they were needle-thin and hardening them over a small, smokeless fire. He drove them into the thick, black mud of the embankments, angled to catch a man's leg as he stepped out of a boat. At the narrowest choke point of the slough, where the cypress knees grew thick like jagged teeth, Jesse rigged a deadfall. He hauled a waterlogged oak timber, weighing nearly 400 pounds, into the canopy, using a system of pulleys and rusted chains. It was triggered by a tripwire stretched just inches above the water's surface. To an untrained eye, it looked like a natural tangle of vines and Spanish moss. To Jesse, it was a kinetic hammer waiting to shatter the hull of an airboat. He didn't stop at physical traps. He utilized psychological warfare, the spooks of the jungle. He rigged small percussion cap noisemakers that would snap like a dry bone if a boat passed too close to the bank, and he smeared the trunks of trees with phosphorus-based paint that would glow with a faint, sickly green hue in the dark. He wanted the Duprees to feel watched. He wanted them to hear the swamp breathing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Delta into a bruised, purple twilight, Jesse sat back in his hidden camp. He checked the action of his M1 carbine, the metallic clack-click sounding strangely loud in the stillness. He was no longer a moonshiner defending a still. He was a commander defending a perimeter. He had turned the black gut into a labyrinth of shadows and hidden edges. He didn't just want to stop the Duprees. He wanted to teach them that some ghosts don't stay buried. The trap was set, the wires were taut, and the Delta was waiting to swallow whoever was foolish enough to enter.
The Delta has a way of amplifying silence just before a catastrophe. On the night of August 19th, the usual cacophony of the swamp, the electric drone of cicadas, and the guttural croak of bullfrogs suddenly cut out, replaced by a vacuum of sound that felt like a held breath. Jesse was a mile away, deep in the black gut, tending to the slow, rhythmic drip of his latest batch when the wind shifted. It didn't bring the usual scent of stagnant water and blooming honeysuckle. It brought the sharp, oily stench of burning cedar and the sweet, sickening smell of toasted corn. By the time Jesse reached the edge of his clearing, the horizon was already bled with a jagged, angry orange. His family's old corn crib, the wooden storehouse that held the very lifeblood of his operation, was a roaring pillar of fire. The dry, seasoned timber was being consumed with a terrifying hunger, the flames licking 40 feet into the humid night sky. Every few seconds, the structure would groan, a sound like a dying animal, before a shower of sparks erupted into the air, carried by the thermal draft like a swarm of glowing locusts. The heat was an invisible wall. It pushed Jesse back, searing his lungs and turning the sweat on his brow into steam. He stood there, silhouetted against the inferno, his shadow stretched long and thin across the red Delta dirt. This wasn't just a fire. It was a message written in the language of the Duprees, primitive, absolute, and scorched into the earth. They hadn't touched the house, and they hadn't touched the barn. They had struck exactly where it hurt his wallet, the raw ingredients. As the roof of the crib finally collapsed in a thunderous crash of burning beams, Jesse noticed something moving in the flickering shadows near the road. A pair of headlights, dim, yellowed, and mocking, flickered once, then twice, before a rusted pickup truck roared into life and sped away, its tires spitting gravel into the night. They wanted him to know they were there. They wanted him to see the silhouettes of the men who had just incinerated his future. Jesse walked toward the porch of his house, his boots crunching on the charred debris that had drifted across the yard like black snow. There, driven deep into the wooden support beam of the porch with a heavy hunting knife, was a scrap of greasy butcher paper. The ink was smudged by the humidity, but the message was clear. It wasn't a threat, it was a territorial claim. The Delta is full, soldier boy. Move on or burn with the trash. He didn't pull the knife out.
He didn't curse or scream. He stood there in the dying glow of the embers, the scent of burnt corn clinging to his clothes and hair. A normal man would have seen the fire as a sign to pack his duffel bag and head back to the city. But Silas Dupree had made a tactical error. He had treated Jesse like a farmer. He had forgotten that Jesse was a man who had watched entire villages burn in the jungle, a man who had learned that when you lose your supply line, you don't retreat. You simplify the battlefield. Turn the environment into a weapon. As the last of the corn cribs smoldered into gray ash, Jesse's eyes didn't reflect the fire anymore. They reflected the cold, dark emptiness of the swamp he was about to weaponize.
Jesse didn't set up his operation in the barn. He knew Silas would look there first. Instead, he utilized the lessons of the Viet Cong, moving his assets into the terrain that others feared. Deep in the heart of the Black Gut, a section of the swamp so dense that even the sun seemed to lose its way, Jesse built his sanctuary. He used a flat-bottomed John boat to ferry the heavy copper equipment, piece by piece, navigating through narrow channels choked with duckweed and cypress knees. By the second week of August, the still was breathing. The setup was a masterpiece of clandestine engineering. Jesse had rigged a smokeless ground fire system, using dried hardwood to minimize the telltale plume of gray smoke. The copper pot, now polished to a dull glow, sat over a bed of blue hot embers. As the corn mash fermented in oak barrels, a recipe he'd refined with a soldier's precision, the air in the clearing became thick and heavy. It was a dizzying, bread-like aroma that mixed with the primal scent of the swamp, creating a cloud of fragrance that felt like a physical weight. The distillation process was a slow, rhythmic ritual. Jesse sat on an upturned crate, his eyes fixed on the thumper keg. He listened to the rhythmic thump, hiss, the heartbeat of the machine. When the first heads began to drip from the copper worm, he tossed them aside. He wasn't interested in the poison Silas sold. He was waiting for the hearts. When it finally came, the liquid was terrifyingly clear, colorless as a mountain spring, but carrying a kick that could fell a mule. He caught a few drops in a tin cup and tossed them onto the embers. They ignited with a brilliant, ghostly blue flame. This was 100-proof white lightning. It didn't have the harsh, oily aftertaste of the Duprees rotcat. It was smooth, carrying the sweet essence of the Delta corn and the cold bite of the spring water. He began filling mason jars, the glass clinking softly in the humid silence. Each jar was a brick in the wall he was building against the bank and the Duprees. Word traveled fast through the local juke joints and back alley bars. They called it Soldier's Shine, and within a week, men were bypassing Silas's territory to find the clear, lethal perfection Jesse was brewing. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a craftsman of a forbidden art, and every jar he filled was a direct challenge to the Dupree throne.
The moonshine trade in the Delta wasn't a free market. It was a monarchy, and the Dupree Clan held the crown with bloodied hands. Their base of operations was a sprawling, ramshackle complex of docks and corrugated metal sheds known as the Fish Camp. It sat on the edge of the Yazoo River, where the water moved as slow and dark as molasses. To the uninitiated, it looked like a failing bait shop. To the locals, it was the headquarters of an empire built on 100-proof fire and intimidation. Big Silas Dupree sat on a rusted lawn chair on the porch of the camp, his presence as oppressive as the afternoon heat. He was a man made of leather and gristle, with skin tanned to the color of a cured tobacco leaf and eyes that had seen too many men disappear into the mud. He wore denim overalls stained with grease and fish scales, and he rarely spoke above a gravelly whisper, a voice that forced everyone around him to lean in, making them vulnerable to his reach. Around him stood his brothers and sons, a wall of sun-scorched muscle and inherited malice. They were men who measured their worth in the number of jugs they moved and the number of rivals they had discouraged. When word reached Silas that smoke was rising from the old Jesse place and that smoke smelled of high-grade corn mash, the atmosphere at the fish camp shifted from lazy to predatory. The first meeting wasn't at the farm, it was on the river road.
Jesse was driving his father's rusted 1965 Chevy C10 when two Dupree trucks, caked in dry Delta mud, boxed him in, forcing him onto the soft shoulder of the road. Silas didn't get out of the truck. He simply rolled down the window, the interior of the cab smelling of menthol cigarettes and raw alcohol. "I heard a rumor, soldier boy," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the horizon, never once looking at Jesse. "I heard you found some old copper in your barn. I'm gonna give you a piece of advice for free. Advice your daddy would have given you if he'd had the sense to stay alive. The Delta is a crowded place. There ain't enough water in that creek for two stills, and I already own the creek." Jesse didn't flinch. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the cracked plastic. He didn't argue or plead. He just looked at Silas with the cold, detached gaze of a man who had seen much scarier things in the jungles of Asia. "The creek belongs to the state, Silas," Jesse replied quietly. "And the barn belongs to me." The silence that followed was heavy with the promise of violence. Silas spat a glob of tobacco juice into the dust, rolled up his window, and signaled his trucks to move. There was no shouting, no threats. In the Delta, the Duprees didn't bark. They just waited for the sun to go down. The war for the white lightning had officially begun, and the lines had been drawn in the red dust of the river road.
When Jesse stepped off the Greyhound bus at the crossroads, he didn't look like a hero returning from the front. He looked like a man who had left his soul somewhere in the thickets of the Ayadrang Valley. His gait was steady but stiff, a lingering habit of navigating booby-trapped jungle trails. He carried a single olive-drab duffel bag, stained with the red dust of a dozen different air bases, and wore a field jacket that smelled of stale cigarettes and Pacific salt. The walk to his family's homestead took him 3 miles down a parched gravel road where the dust kicked up by the wind coated his throat in a dry, bitter grit. When the farmhouse finally appeared through the heat shimmer, it wasn't the sanctuary he had dreamed of in his foxhole. The porch was sagging like a tired spine. The white paint had been stripped away by years of relentless sun until only the gray, weathered wood remained. Fields, once lush with cotton and corn, overgrown with waist-high weeds and skeletal stalks of dead sunflowers. His father was gone, taken by a lung fever 2 winters back, and his mother had followed shortly after, her heart simply giving out under the weight of the loneliness. Jesse stood in the center of the kitchen, where the only sound was the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of a cooling metal roof and the buzz of a lone fly against a cracked window pane. The air inside was stagnant, smelling of old newsprint and the ghostly scent of dried lavender. He didn't find hope in the house, but he found a purpose in the barn. Behind a false wall of rotted cedar planks, hidden beneath a mountain of moldy burlap sacks, he found it, his grandfather's pride. It was a massive, hand-hammered copper still, its surface dull with a green patina of age, but its structure still solid and true. Beside it sat a stack of dusty glass carboys and a copper worm coil that looked like a sleeping snake. In the Delta, when the crops fail and the banks start calling, there is only one way to make the mortgage. Jesse ran a hand over the cold, oxidized metal. He knew that chemistry of the jungle, the napalm, the cordite, the diesel. He realized then that the still was just another weapon, and the moonshine was just another form of ammunition. He didn't want to be a criminal. He just wanted to keep the only dirt he had left. As he began to clear away the cobwebs, his eyes lost their vacant stare and sharpened into a predatory focus. He wasn't a farmer anymore, and he wasn't a soldier. He was a moonshiner, and he was home.
To understand the war for white lightning, one must first understand the Delta. In 1974, this wasn't just a geographical location. It was a slow, wet pressure that squeezed the lungs of anyone who dared to dwell within its borders. The air didn't just hang, it stagnated. It was a thick, invisible soup, saturated with 90% humidity that turned cotton shirts into a second, suffocating skin within minutes of sunrise. It was an environment that demanded a certain kind of stillness, a place where movement was an effort and silence was a survival strategy. The Delta had a scent that was unmistakable and inescapable.
It was a complex, layered perfume of the Earth's slow digestion. At its base was the smell of the mud, rich, black buckshot soil that held on to water like a grudge, smelling of ancient silt and rotted timber. Layered over that was the cloying, sweet stench of the vegetation, the honeyed aroma of blooming honeysuckle, fighting against the sharp, acidic tang of decaying cypress needles. But in the hidden coves of the black gut, these natural scents were overpowered by the man-made evidence of sin. There, the air carried the mash ghost, the heavy, bread-like smell of fermenting corn, sugar, and yeast. It was a thick, yeasty vapor that clung to the Spanish moss, a scent so potent it could make a man feel lightheaded before he even took a sip of the finished product. Mixed into this was the sharp, metallic bite of diesel exhaust from the airboats and the faint, sulfurous whiff of spent gunpowder that never quite dissipated in the stagnant air. The sounds of the Delta provided a deafening, rhythmic backdrop to the moonshine trade. It was a cacophony of the wild, constant, high-pitched electric hum of cicadas that rose and fell like a siren, the guttural, subterranean thrum of bull alligators marking their territory in the deep sloughs, and the occasional sudden splash of an alligator gar breaking the surface of the black water. These sounds acted as a natural veil, masking the clinking of glass jugs, the hiss of steam from copper pipes, and the hushed, urgent whispers of men who operated only under the cover of a new moon. Visually, the Delta was a world of shadows and monochromatic greens. The weeping willows draped over the water's edge like tattered curtains, and the Spanish moss hung in long, gray funeral veils from the garnered branches of cypress trees that had stood since before the Civil War. The sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor, appearing only as thin, dusty spears of gold that illuminated the trillions of gnats dancing in the humid air. In this landscape, human morality seemed to melt away, replaced by the primal necessity of the swamp. It was a place that felt forgotten by time and ignored by the law. Here, the heat made people slow, but the moonshine made them fast, and the combination was a volatile mix that was always one spark away from an explosion. The Delta didn't just host the war, it fed it, providing the cover, the ingredients, and ultimately, the unmarked graves for those who lost. The Mississippi Delta in 1974 did not recognize the laws of men. It only recognized the laws of the mud. Deep within the labyrinthine network of blackwater bayous known as the Black Gut, the air was a physical weight, a hot, wet blanket that carried the scent of rotten vegetation and the sickly sweet tang of fermenting corn mash. This was the birthplace of white lightning, a liquid fire so potent it could run a tractor engine or stop a man's heart. At precisely 2:14 a.m., the humid silence was brutally decapitated. The sound didn't come from the wildlife, but from the mechanical roar of a high-compression airboat engine. The sound was a rhythmic, guttural thrum that vibrated through the Spanish moss hanging like tattered funeral veils from the ancient cypress trees. Through the swirling wall of gray fog, a single blinding searchlight cut a tunnel of yellow light, illuminating the black water where alligators slipped beneath the surface, undisturbed by the coming violence. In the lead boat, 4 men from the Dupree Clan sat low, their faces hardened into masks of murderous intent. They were Big Silas's boys, born and bred in the silt of the Delta, and they carried the tools of their trade, sawed-off 12-gauge shotguns and heavy glass jugs of kerosene. They weren't there to talk. They were there to erase a ghost. The soldier boy, Jesse, had been cutting into their profits for 6 months, and in the Dupree Code of Ethics, that was a debt that could only be settled with lead. "I see the steam," one of the men shouted over the roar of the fan. He pointed a calloused finger toward a hidden cove where a thin, ghostly plume of white vapor rose from a thicket of weeping willows. It was the vent from Jesse's copper still, the rhythmic breathing of a hidden giant. The airboat banked hard,
its flat bottom slapping against the water with the sound of a gunshot. But as they crossed the threshold of the cove, the world changed. The searchlight caught something for a split second. A thin, shimmering line of monofilament fishing wire stretched across the channel, 6 inches above the waterline. "Tripwire!" the driver screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the engine. The wire didn't break. Instead, it triggered a counterweight system Jesse had learned in the jungles of the Central Highlands. Above the boat, a heavy, sharpened cypress log, suspended by rusted chains, swung down from the canopy with the speed of a fallen guillotine. It struck the airboat's protective cage with a deafening screech of rending metal. The fan disintegrated, sending shards of steel blades through the air like shrapnel. The boat spun out of control, the engine screaming in its death throes before dying into a terrifying sudden silence. The 4 men were thrown into the waist-deep muck, their shotguns sinking into the silt. As they struggled to find their footing in the dark, the swamp remained unnervingly still. No bird called, no frog croaked. Then, from the darkness of the willow thicket, a single orange spark appeared. It wasn't a flash of light, but the cherry of a cigarette. Jesse was sitting on a fallen log, his army fatigue jacket damp with sweat, watching them. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply raised a vintage M1 carbine, and the orange muzzle flash illuminated his hollowed-out eyes for a microsecond. The first shot didn't hit a man. It hit a pressurized tank of alcohol sitting on the back of the wrecked boat. The explosion was instantaneous. A pillar of blue and orange flame turned the black water into a mirror of hell. The heat was so intense it gurgled the leaves of the trees 50 feet away. In the flickering light of the inferno, the Dupree boys realized they weren't the predators anymore. They were the harvest, and Jesse, the man the war had broken, was finally finishing the job that Delta had started.